The estate had always been alive, not with warmth, but with precision. Curtains opened at 6. Breakfast trays rolled at 7. Floors polished by 9. Voices lowered by 10. And through it all, she moved like clockwork, unseen, unbothered, expected. The girl in the background. The maid. To most, she was a shape that carried towels, a hand that poured coffee, a shadow that swept in and out without speaking. No one asked her name. No one remembered when she had arrived or that she had always been there. She had grown up on these floors, between these walls, beneath these ceilings. Once a child with bare feet on the back marble. Then a teenager sweeping staircases she once ran down giggling. By her 20th birthday, she knew the names of every guest before they arrived, not from announcements, but from years of whispered conversations overheard behind heavy doors. She knew how much champagne each of them drank. She knew who cheated, who owed, who feared irrelevance the most. And they never saw her. Not really. Because they didn't look down. Because she moved in the space below their attention. And she let them. Because silence made her powerful. She had learned long ago that to be underestimated was to be protected. No one guarded against the maid. No one questioned when she entered a room. No one noticed when she lingered near old portraits, papers, ledgers tucked in forgotten drawers. They didn't know she could read. That she had taught herself late at night with books discarded from the estate's library. That she had studied law by candlelight and inheritance codes with the hunger of someone who had nothing but could feel everything just out of reach. She memorized dates, tracked signatures, learned the language of ownership and legacy. Not because she wanted revenge, because she wanted the truth. And the truth, she discovered it one afternoon, dusting the private study when a yellowed envelope slipped from between 2 ledger books. Sealed with wax. Stamped with the family crest. Inside, a will. Signed. Dated. Buried. Not by accident. The name written on the top wasn't one of the siblings currently jockeying for position, nor any of the cousins draped across settees arguing about share percentages. It was hers. Not metaphorically. Not ambiguously. Legally. Unquestionably. She stood alone in that office, the weight of generations pressing down through the rafters, and let the knowledge settle like iron in her bones. They had lied. Or rather, they had erased. Because people like her weren't supposed to be in the room. Not supposed to inherit, to rule, to own. She ran her fingers across the edge of the paper, heart steady. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She filed it away. Made copies. Began to plan. Because truth meant nothing in silence. It had to be spoken, loudly, undeniably, in front of every single face that had never seen her. And so she waited. She ironed their napkins. Polished their glassware. Tucked away insults wrapped in silk and perfume. Until the night of the gala. The night when the estate filled to bursting with those who believed themselves untouchable. The night they wore the history of their bloodlines like armor and draped their contempt in velvet. She dressed as they expected, black dress, modest shoes. Hair neat, hands clean. But beneath that was something different. Something unstoppable. She moved through the ballroom with her usual quiet grace, carrying nothing but a slim leather folder tucked beneath her arm, one that held the weight of truth no chandelier could outshine. They didn't see her. Even then. As they laughed. As they toasted. As they asked, without looking, who had let the maid in. And so they would be blindsided. Because sometimes power doesn't arrive in thunder. Sometimes it walks silently. Until it stands in the center of everything. And claims its name. The announcement was scheduled for midnight, timed perfectly to catch the revelers at their most self-satisfied, their defenses dulled by wine and arrogance. The great clock in the ballroom struck 11:30. She waited in the shadow of a column, observing the swirl of silk and cashmere, the lazy drifting of conversations loaded with old money politics. To them, the gala was not just a party. It was confirmation, an unspoken agreement that the world would continue to spin under their control, predictable and obedient, locked in the cycle of the familiar. And she, in their eyes, was part of that machinery, a servant to keep their world running smooth, invisible except when she failed. But they had forgotten something ancient and dangerous, that the foundations they stood on had names carved deep beneath the stone. Names that could not be erased by titles or dresses or laughter. Names like hers. At 11:45, the lawyer arrived. He wore a simple black suit, not the tailored flashiness of the heirs circling the champagne fountains, but the quiet armor of someone who dealt in absolute truths. He moved through the crowd with the unsettling ease of a blade sliding through silk. Few noticed him. Those who did assumed he was another background figure, a vendor, a courier, a messenger. No one important. Exactly as they had misjudged her. They spoke of business, of mergers, of trusts fattened by generations of careful hoarding. Their smiles tightened only when the lawyer climbed the small platform near the orchestra and tapped the microphone once. The soft pop echoed across the marble. Chatter faded. Conversations hung unfinished in midair. Brows furrowed. Who was this? Why now? The lawyer cleared his throat and spoke, each word slow and precise. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, thank you for gathering here tonight. A few restless murmurs stirred. This was not on the program. Not on the schedule their assistants had triple confirmed. The woman in diamonds, the one who had sneered at her hours earlier, clicked her tongue impatiently. Who organized this? Someone hissed nearby, but no answer came, because the moment was already shifting. The lawyer continued. It is my duty, he said, to inform you of a recent legal development regarding the inheritance of this estate. Now silence. Real silence. Sharp, heavy, the kind that falls before earthquakes. From her place near the column, she watched their faces shift. Curiosity to confusion to cold, gnawing fear. The lawyer opened the leather folder, her leather folder, and began to read. The room tightened as the words unfolded. The description of the original owner's wishes, the conditions left undisclosed until now, the clauses hidden in plain sight. And then the name, her name, spoken aloud under the glittering chandeliers, carved into the air more permanently than any marble etching. For a moment, there was only the mechanical hum of the lights. Then came the ripple, a sharp intake of breath from one corner, a broken laugh from another. The woman in diamonds dropped her flute of champagne. The crystal shattered across the marble like brittle ice. Someone muttered a curse under their breath. The lawyer did not pause. He read the confirmation, the legal attachments, the final decree. Ownership, authority, legacy, all transferred immediately, irrevocably to her. She stepped forward then, not rushed, not hesitant. Each footfall echoed louder than the lawyer's voice. She didn't need an announcement. Her presence was announcement enough. The crowd parted for her the way rivers shift for mountains. Not because they understood yet, but because something primal inside them, the same instincts that once knelt at the feet of queens and conquerors, recognized the shift even before their minds did. She reached the platform and nodded once at the lawyer. He closed the file with a soft snap and stepped aside. For the first time, dozens of faces turned fully toward her, not as a servant, but as something they no longer had the words to dismiss. She met their gazes without fear, because their recognition came too late, because their approval had never been required. She didn't need to gloat, didn't need to explain. She only had to exist fully, visibly, undeniably, in the space they thought she would never be allowed to occupy. And that was more powerful than any crown, any contract, any ceremony they could have imagined. Midnight struck. 12 heavy chimes that rang through the bones of the estate. A new day, a new world, one they would now have to live in, one she had been destined to rule. The 12th chime faded into the rafters, leaving the ballroom suspended in an eerie, fragile silence. For a long heartbeat, no one moved. Then the ripple began. Small at first, a shuffle of polished shoes, a tightening of tailored collars, a murmur that grew teeth. They whispered her name as if it were a question, as if speaking it aloud might make it less real. It's a mistake. Some kind of loophole. She can't possibly. But the papers were signed. The seal was real. The law was carved deep and sharp, far beyond the reach of their denial. She stood at the center of it all, still in her simple black dress, the same one they had associated with servitude an hour ago. No crown, no new costume to signal her authority, only the steady, unflinching truth of her presence. The first to react was the patriarch of one of the oldest families, a man whose handshake once brokered city contracts, whose word had closed more deals than any signature. He approached, slow, deliberate, a smile stretched too tightly across his weathered face. "My dear," he began, voice oily, "surely we can come to some understanding." She turned to him fully forcing him to meet her eyes. Eyes that did not beg, did not flinch, did not yield. "There's no misunderstanding," she said softly. "This is the understanding." His smile twitched at the edges, threatening to fall apart. Behind him, others stirred. The woman in diamonds clutching the arm of her companion. The twins who had laughed the loudest when someone mocked her at dinner last season now whispering furiously behind gilded fans. They scrambled to recalibrate, to figure out how to reshape the narrative. They floated false kindnesses toward her, offers disguised as compliments. "You must feel overwhelmed. We can help manage things. Of course, we'll support you. It's what the family would want. You've earned your place here, dear. We just want to make sure you're not burdened." Burdened. As if the crown she had reclaimed was a weight too heavy for someone like her. As if their sudden, desperate proximity could rewrite the story unfolding around them. She smiled. Not cruelly, not coldly, but with a steady patience they mistook for innocence. She understood their fear better than they understood their own. It wasn't fear of her wealth. It was fear of irrelevance. Fear that their power, inherited, not earned, would no longer shield them. Fear that the girl they had once shooed from the room would now dictate which doors stayed open and which slammed shut. The room smelled faintly of sweat now, beneath the perfume and champagne. Panic poorly masked by etiquette. She let them squirm. Let them exhaust themselves offering half-hearted allegiances, spinning tales about shared futures that none of them believed. And when they had tangled themselves thoroughly enough, she spoke again, voice carrying clearly across the marble. "There will be changes," she said simply. "No threats, no theatrics, just the quiet finality of a new sovereign setting the tone." The lawyer stood behind her, silent, an anchor to the moment's gravity. The old elite glanced at one another, reading each other's panic, searching for some collective strategy, and finding none. Because she hadn't just disrupted the surface of their world. She had struck at the foundation, at the belief that power belonged only to those who had never had to fight for it, at the comfortable illusion that some were born to serve and others to rule. And that illusion was crumbling now, piece by piece, right in front of them. She turned away from them then, not with contempt, but with indifference. The truest wound. She had no desire to punish them. Their irrelevance was punishment enough. As she moved toward the grand staircase that spiraled upward toward the private wings. Her wings now, the crowd parted again, slower this time. Resigned, terrified. She could hear their breath catch. Could feel the shape of their new reality tightening around them like a closing fist. They would smile when she passed. They would bow, because they understood finally what they had refused to see when it still might have saved them. That the girl they had called maid had been the heir all along, and there was no place left for them to hide. Not behind their names, not behind their fortunes, not even behind their polished, trembling smiles. Because history had already shifted, and she was writing it now. The heavy oak doors of the private study closed behind her with a deep, resonant thud. It was quiet here, too quiet after the frantic murmurs of the ballroom. She stood alone for the first time that evening, her hands still, her breathing even, as she gazed around the room that had, for so long, been forbidden territory. The portraits of the old patriarchs stared down from the paneled walls, men who had built fortunes on the labor of invisible hands, who believed ownership was destiny carved in bloodlines. She moved slowly to the desk at the center of the room. It was massive, carved from dark wood, worn smooth by generations of signatures that shaped contracts, marriages, inheritances, always in favor of those already cradled by privilege. She ran her fingers lightly across its surface. They had never thought to imagine someone like her sitting here. They had spent years ensuring it. She could trace it now with the clarity of hindsight. The subtle ways they kept her small. The casual rebukes dressed as jokes. The opportunities dangled and yanked away just before she could grasp them. The whispered rumors that made sure doors closed before she even knocked. Even after she had uncovered the will, the true will, they hadn't made it easy. The fake documents. The missing files. The endless miscommunications. Every delay was a strategy. Every lie a desperate attempt to protect their illusion. But the truth, once unearthed, had a gravity of its own. She hadn't fought them with fury. She fought them with patience. With evidence. With the law, the same law they had always assumed would protect them and crush her. When the court hearings began, they hadn't even looked at her when she entered the chamber. They had spoken over her, around her, to the judges, to the clerks, as if she were a malfunction they could fix by pretending it didn't exist. But she existed. She existed in every page of testimony, every notarized signature, every clause they had conveniently forgotten but she had remembered. And when the final ruling came down clean, unchallengeable, she hadn't smiled. Victory wasn't a moment. It was a long, slow reclaiming. Tonight was just the latest step in a journey that had started years ago when she first realized that loyalty to a system built to exclude her was nothing but slow self-erasure. She walked to the wall safe now, the one hidden behind a false panel of books. She had seen the butlers pretend not to notice it. Seen the patriarchs press their fingerprints against the polished brass. Now it was hers. She opened it. Inside were documents older than memory, land grants, titles, bonds tied to fortunes spanning generations. But these weren't just paper. They were keys. Keys to power, to narrative, to the future. And they belonged to her now. The irony was almost laughable. The very people who had built this fortress of legacy had, through arrogance and carelessness, left the door wide open for the girl they never considered a threat. She gathered what she needed, not greedily, not hungrily. Carefully, with the precision of someone who understood that real inheritance wasn't about wealth. It was about agency. About standing in a room and knowing you didn't have to ask anyone for permission to exist there. She returned to the desk and sat, the leather chair creaking softly under her weight. No grand gestures. No shouted proclamations. Just the quiet, seismic act of being. Outside the doors, she could hear the hesitant sounds of the old world trying to stitch itself back together, apologies offered too late, alliances whispered in corners. Let them scramble. Let them try. Their time was over. She placed the deeds, the ledgers, the certificates neatly on the desk before her. Symbols of a power they tried to hide, but which had all along belonged to the girl they thought could be erased. She folded her hands in her lap and waited, because soon they would come knocking. They would come pretending nothing had changed, and she would greet them not as the maid they dismissed, but as the heir they could no longer ignore. The knock came at noon the next day. Polite, measured, insistent without urgency, the kind of knock that assumed it would be answered simply because it always had been. She rose from behind the great desk, her desk now, and moved toward the door with the same quiet patience that had carried her through the storm they hadn't even realized was coming. When she opened it, 3 figures stood waiting. The patriarch, his silver hair combed to an immaculate shine. The woman in diamonds, her smile stretched taut over desperation. A younger man, a cousin she barely remembered, carrying a slim leather briefcase and an expression polished to a mirror sheen. All 3 masked their fear with civility. "May we come in?" the patriarch asked, voice coated in the familiar syrup of entitlement dressed up as courtesy. She stepped aside without speaking. They entered like generals stepping onto a battlefield they believed they still controlled. The cousin placed the briefcase carefully on the desk, clicking it open with theatrical precision. Inside, a thick sheaf of papers, neatly arranged, the ink still smelling faintly of fresh signatures. "We wanted to make this easy," the patriarch said, settling into the chair across from her without waiting to be invited. "No need for any lingering unpleasantness." She said nothing. The woman in diamonds leaned forward, her voice dripping with manufactured warmth. "You've done remarkably well," she said, as if offering praise to a child who had performed a difficult trick. "But managing an estate of this size, it's a monumental task. Overwhelming, even." The cousin slid a document across the desk toward her. An offer. It glittered on the surface, promises of advisory roles, generous stipends, access to all the privileges without the burdens of true ownership. All she had to do was sign. All she had to do was step back. Let them continue running the show with her safely tucked away as a figurehead. Respectable. Silent. Contained. They waited for her to reach for the pen. Waited for her to fold back into the role they had crafted for her long before she knew the game was even being played. She looked down at the papers. The numbers were impressive. The benefits exhaustive. A life of comfort carefully boxed and sealed with a bow labeled gratitude. They thought they were offering salvation. They didn't realize they were offering a cage. She lifted her eyes to meet theirs, calm, steady, unflinching. And then, without a word, she pushed the briefcase gently back across the desk. The cousin's polished mask cracked first, a flicker of disbelief flashing behind his tailored smile. The patriarch's hands clenched subtly on the arms of his chair. The woman in diamonds leaned back, her eyes narrowing. "You don't understand," the patriarch said, voice low and dangerous now. "This isn't personal. It's about what's best for the family." She allowed herself the smallest of smiles. No, she said softly. It's about what's best for your version of the family. She rose, the chair scraping lightly against the polished floor. You built this world assuming it would always belong to you, she continued, her voice gathering strength without rising in volume. You thought bloodlines were walls. You thought tradition was armor. She stepped closer, forcing them to look up at her, an inversion they had never prepared for. But you forgot that blood alone doesn't make a legacy. She placed a hand lightly on the desk where the real deeds, the real ownership rested beneath her fingers. Stewardship does. Integrity does. Vision does. The woman in diamonds scoffed, but the sound was brittle. Hollow. You think you can do better? She sneered. She smiled again, wider this time. I don't think, she said. I know. The patriarch stood abruptly, his chair rocking back against the wall. This estate, he snapped. This family, it demands a certain kind of leadership, discipline, decorum. And you, she said, voice like velvet over steel, demand obedience. She turned away, signaling the conversation was over. Behind her, the cousin fumbled to gather the papers, the briefcase snapping shut with a frustrated crack. Without another word, they left, the great doors swinging closed behind them with a finality that echoed through the cavernous halls. She stood alone again, not because she was isolated, because she had chosen it. She would rebuild the estate on different foundations, ones they could never have imagined, rooted in service, in renewal, in the belief that inheritance was not a prize handed down but a responsibility earned every day. They thought they could by her silence, by her compliance, by her soul. They never understood that what she carried inside her, the quiet, indestructible certainty of her worth, had never been for sale, and it never would be. Weeks passed, and the old world they had clung to began to unravel without ceremony. There were no announcements, no great proclamations, just slow, inevitable shifts, like tides pulling away the sand under a once mighty fortress. At first, the changes were small. The staff, once trained to look through her, now met her eyes when she entered a room. Contracts once negotiated in smoky backrooms were dragged into the light, scrutinized, redrafted. Resources once hoarded at the top began flowing outward, to community projects, to scholarships, to ventures that rebuilt rather than exploited. The estate that had once stood as a monument to exclusion slowly transformed into a living, breathing organism. One built not to preserve privilege, but to distribute opportunity. She sat often at the desk in the private study, the golden afternoon sun pouring through the tall windows. The portraits of the old patriarchs still hung on the walls, but their gaze no longer intimidated her. She let them watch, let them bear silent witness to a new chapter being written. Because legacies, she understood now, weren't protected by tradition. They were justified by action. She traveled beyond the estate, to towns that had been neglected when the family found no profit in their suffering, to schools that had never received donations because their students wore the wrong kind of shoes. She sat at kitchen tables and listened more than she spoke. And everywhere she went, she carried with her the same simple message. Ownership is not just a privilege, it's a duty. And she honored it with every decision, every signature, every refusal to play the old games. Word spread, slow at first, then faster. Investors once too proud to acknowledge her now waited weeks for meetings. Foundations once dismissive now sought partnerships they could no longer demand on their terms. And still she chose carefully. Still she remembered the cold looks, the dismissive laughs, the heavy, suffocating weight of invisibility. She wore that memory like armor, not as bitterness, but as clarity. One rainy evening, as she walked through the gardens now open to the public, once a playground for the privileged few, she paused beneath the old oak tree where, years ago, she had hidden to read books stolen from the library. The same tree where she had first dreamed of a different life. She placed a hand against the rough bark, feeling the slow heartbeat of the earth. This, all of it, had always been possible. It only needed someone who refused to accept "not for you" as an answer. She smiled quietly to herself. Somewhere beyond the gates, the old families still grumbled, still gossiped, still plotted their small, desperate games. Let them. The future wasn't being decided in their parlors anymore. It was being written here, under her watch, in every student whose tuition she funded, in every entrepreneur who found a grant instead of a locked door, in every family who walked these grounds without fear or apology. This was the real inheritance. Not land, not titles, not wealth, but possibility. And she would guard it fiercely, not by hoarding it, but by ensuring it spread so wide and deep that no one could ever roll it back. The rain softened to mist around her as she turned back toward the estate, her steps steady, her heart unshakable. She had not just claimed what was hers. She had transformed it. And the world, the real world, not the brittle kingdom of the old names, would never be the same. Because the girl they once sneered at, the girl they thought could be pushed aside, had done what none of them ever dared. She built a legacy not for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And this was only the beginning.